The extremely uneventful day of Arun, Part 1. Arun woke up at exactly 6:17 a.m., not because he had set an alarm for that time, but because his alarm, set for 6:15, had failed to ring. This was not unusual. The alarm clock had been slightly unreliable ever since it had fallen off the bedside table 3 months ago. Arun had considered replacing it, but every time he thought about doing so, he found himself mildly distracted and then forgot. He lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling. The ceiling had a faint crack running diagonally from one corner to the other. Arun had noticed this crack many times before, and each time he wondered whether it had grown longer. He could never quite remember what it had looked like previously, so he was unable to reach a conclusion. After about 2 minutes of thinking about the crack, Arun sat up. The bedsheet was slightly wrinkled near his feet. He smoothed it out with his hand, not because it needed to be perfectly smooth, but because it felt like something that should be done before getting out of bed. He stood up, stretched very lightly, just enough to feel like he had stretched, and then walked to the window. The curtains were already half open. He didn't remember opening them the night before, but he assumed he must have. Outside, the sky was a pale, undecided shade between blue and gray. It was not particularly interesting. A bird flew past the window. Arun watched it for a moment, then lost interest. He turned and walked to the bathroom. The floor tiles were cool, which he noticed but did not react strongly to. He turned on the tap and waited for the water to reach a temperature that was neither too cold nor too warm. This took slightly longer than expected. While waiting, he looked at himself in the mirror. His hair was slightly messy, though not in a way that could be described as stylish. He considered fixing it immediately, then decided it would be more efficient to do so after washing his face. The water finally reached a satisfactory temperature. Arun washed his face slowly, using the same circular motions he always used. He did not rush. There was no reason to rush. After drying his face with a towel that was not entirely dry, he picked up his toothbrush. He applied toothpaste in a straight line, paused briefly to ensure it was centered, and then began brushing. He brushed for exactly 2 minutes, not because he was timing himself consciously, but because he had developed a habit of brushing for what felt like 2 minutes, which was usually close enough. When he finished, he rinsed his mouth, rinsed the toothbrush, and placed it back in its holder, at the same angle as before. He then returned to his room and opened his wardrobe. Inside were several shirts that looked quite similar to one another. He stared at them for a moment, trying to decide which one to wear. After a short period of consideration, he chose the one that was closest to the front. It was a light blue shirt, or possibly a slightly faded blue. He wasn't entirely sure. He put it on, buttoning each button carefully, starting from the top instead of the bottom, which he had once tried but found unsatisfying. After getting dressed, Arun checked his phone. There were no new messages. He refreshed the screen anyway, just in case. There were still no messages. He placed the phone back on the table. Then he stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next, even though he knew exactly what he usually did next. Eventually he walked toward the kitchen. The kitchen was quiet. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Arun noticed the ticking, as he always did, and then gradually stopped noticing it, as he always did. He opened the refrigerator. Inside, there was milk, some vegetables, a container of something he had cooked 2 days ago, and a bottle of water. He looked at all of these items without making a decision for several seconds. Finally, he took out the milk. He poured it into a pan and placed the pan on the stove. He turned the knob slightly too far, then adjusted it back. The flame settled into a steady, unremarkable shape. While the milk heated, Arun leaned lightly against the counter and looked around the kitchen. Everything was where it usually was. Nothing seemed out of place. This was neither good nor bad. It simply was, and Arun was quietly okay with that. The extremely uneventful day of Arun, Part 2. Arun continued to stand in the kitchen, watching the milk as it slowly approached a temperature that might eventually be considered warm. Small bubbles began to form at the edges of the pan, though not in any particularly exciting way. He adjusted his stance slightly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. This did not significantly improve his comfort, but it gave him something to do. After a while, he realized he was still holding the refrigerator door slightly open. He closed it gently, making sure it sealed properly. He listened for the faint suction sound that indicated it had closed completely. The sound occurred, as expected. He returned his attention to the milk. It seemed marginally warmer now. Arun considered making tea. This thought appeared, lingered briefly, and then drifted away without being acted upon. Instead, he decided that warm milk was sufficient. He opened a cabinet and took out a cup. It was one of several identical cups, all of which had been part of a set he had purchased some time ago. He could not remember exactly when. The cup was clean, though there was a small water spot near the rim. He noticed it, considered wiping it, and then decided it was not necessary. The milk was now warm enough. He turned off the stove, lifted the pan carefully, and poured the milk into the cup. A small amount nearly spilled, but did not. Arun noticed this and felt a mild sense of relief that quickly faded. He placed the pan back on the stove, slightly off-center, then adjusted it so it sat properly. Holding the cup, he walked to the table and sat down. The chair made a faint scraping sound against the floor. Arun paused, then lifted the chair slightly and repositioned it more carefully. This time, there was no sound. It was warm. Not too warm, not too cold. He took another sip, this time without thinking about the temperature. On the table there was a newspaper. It had been delivered earlier that morning, though Arun had not noticed when. He pulled it closer and looked at the front page. The headlines were there. They appeared to be about various things happening in different places. Arun read the first headline. Then he read it again, not because it was particularly complex, but because his mind had wandered slightly during the first reading. He turned the page. There were more headlines. He read some of them. He did not read others. After a few minutes, he realized he had been holding the cup without drinking from it. He took another sip. The milk was now slightly less warm than before. This did not bother him. He continued reading, occasionally pausing to look at the clock on the wall. The time moved forward at its usual pace. At one point, he noticed a small crumb on the table. He wasn't sure where it had come from. He looked at it for a moment, then brushed it aside with his finger. It fell to the floor. He considered picking it up, but decided it could be dealt with later. After finishing the milk, Arun stood up and carried the cup to the sink. He rinsed it immediately, rather than leaving it there. He preferred not to let dishes accumulate, though sometimes they did anyway. He placed the cup upside down on the drying rack. It leaned slightly to one side. He adjusted it until it stood more evenly. Then he stood there for a moment, looking at the sink. There was nothing particularly notable about it. He turned off the kitchen light, even though it was still morning, and the light had not been strictly necessary. Returning to the main room, Arun glanced at his phone again. He opened an app, scrolled briefly without focusing on anything in particular, and then closed it. He placed the phone down in almost the exact same position as before, though perhaps a centimeter to the left. He noticed the difference. He adjusted it back. Satisfied, he stepped away. There was still some time before he needed to do anything specific, although what that something was remained somewhat undefined. Arun walked to the window again and looked outside. The sky had changed slightly. It was now a more definite shade of blue, though still not especially striking. A person walked by on the street below. Arun watched them for a few seconds, then stopped. He wondered briefly where they might be going. He did not attempt to guess. Instead, he turned away from the window and looked around the room as if expecting something to have changed. Nothing had. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. Then he walked toward the chair and sat down again, this time without making any sound at all. He folded his hands in his lap, and for a short while, he did absolutely nothing. The extremely uneventful day of Arun, Part 3. Arun remained seated, his hands folded loosely in his lap. The position was neither particularly comfortable nor uncomfortable. It simply existed, much like the rest of the morning. After some time, he was not entirely sure how long, he became aware of a faint sound. It was the ticking of the clock again. He had stopped noticing it earlier, but now it had returned to his attention without any clear reason. Tick, tick, tick. He listened to it for a while, not counting the seconds, but still somehow aware that they were passing. Eventually he shifted slightly in his chair. This caused a very soft creak, which he noticed immediately. He adjusted his posture to prevent the chair from making the sound again. It worked. His gaze moved slowly across the room, pausing briefly on objects that had been there for as long as he could remember. the table, the shelf, the corner where nothing in particular was kept. Everything appeared as it always did. Arun stood up. There was no specific reason for standing up, but remaining seated had begun to feel like a completed activity. He walked over to the shelf and looked at the items arranged on it. There were a few books, stacked vertically, and one placed horizontally on top of the others. He noticed that the horizontal book was slightly misaligned. He adjusted it so that its edges matched the books beneath it more precisely. He stepped back to observe the change. It was subtle. He accepted it. Next to the books was a small object he had once considered useful. He picked it up, examined it briefly, and then placed it back in almost the exact same position. The difference, if any, was minimal. Arun then walked to the corner of the room, the one that contained nothing in particular. He stood there for a moment, as if confirming that it still contained nothing. It did. He turned around and walked back. As he passed the table, he noticed that one of the legs was not perfectly aligned with the others. This had likely always been the case. He crouched down slightly to look more closely. After a brief inspection, he concluded that there was nothing he could or needed to do about it. He stood back up. The room remained quiet. Arun glanced at the clock again. Time had continued to move forward, though not in any surprising way. He walked to the kitchen, not because he needed anything, but because it felt like the next place to go. Upon entering, he paused, as if expecting to remember why he had come there. No reason presented itself. He looked at the drying rack. The cup he had used earlier was still there, now fully dry. He touched it lightly, confirming this, though confirmation had not been necessary. He placed the cup back in the cabinet, aligning it with the others. Then he opened the refrigerator again. Everything inside appeared unchanged. He nodded slightly, though there was no one to observe this gesture. Closing the refrigerator, he leaned briefly against the counter. He considered the possibility of preparing something else to eat or drink, but the thought did not develop into action. Instead, he pushed himself away from the counter and returned to the main room. As he walked, he became aware of the sound of his own footsteps. They were soft, consistent, and unremarkable. He sat down once more, this time in a slightly different position than before. The difference was small, but noticeable to him. He placed his hands on the table. Then he moved them back to his lap. Then, after a moment, he placed one hand on the table and left the other in his lap. This arrangement seemed acceptable. He remained like this for a while. At some point, he blinked. Then he blinked again, though not immediately. The light in the room had shifted slightly, as the sun had moved higher in the sky. The change was gradual, almost unnoticeable, unless one was looking for it. Arun was not looking for it, but he noticed it anyway. He looked toward the window. The same street was visible. The same general stillness remained. A faint breeze moved the curtain just enough to be observed, but not enough to draw attention. Arun watched it for a few seconds. Then he looked away. He took a slow breath in, and then a slow breath out. There was nothing particularly significant about either breath. They simply happened. And with that, the morning continued, in much the same way it had begun.